that this has been a challenging week for us all. We've witnessed scenes of violence and civil unrest and massive destruction, and of course it has produced a lot of pain and distress for all of us. It is very difficult witnessing that, worrying about the country and the future, and worrying about the people whose lives and livelihoods have been affected and even lost by the terrible violence that has been happening. There's very little we can do, although very much we want to do something about the causes and the outcomes of all of this kind of violence. We're not here really to talk about political things at all. But whenever things are going on in the world that we can't understand and that we struggle with because we feel so powerless, it is also an opportunity to reflect on where can we make a difference? What can we do in our world? We might not be able to do something about what's happening in those strife-torn areas, but we all live amongst other people, and there's always something we can do to improve our own experience and those of others around us, even if it is the smallest way that we do that. It is, of course, the Stoics, who I've spoken about frequently on this show, who remind us that we can only worry about those things that we are actually in control of. And, of course, we are not in control of much of what we see happening around us that way. While it is important to stay informed, that does worry me about our tendency to consume massive amounts of news, let alone the massive amounts of misinformation that people send around on WhatsApp and Facebook and other social networks. Considering the fact that there's nothing we can do about it individually, and also that it doesn't necessarily have something to do with you per se, sometimes I question, why do we watch all that news? What is the benefit in watching all that news? My dad used to read the newspaper every morning and then get on with his life, which was challenging and busy enough. And he'd read again the next morning, catch up with what's happened. And for me, that's always been a great lesson. There is no need to consume massive amounts of news, especially since it's repetitive, and especially since we know that we live in a world where the news media, as valiantly as they do try to keep us informed, also tend to emphasize things that are most dramatic and most violent, that are most headline grabbing. It's an industry and it's trying to sell things, and it's always going to work that way. So we tend to get excited and then fearful and anxious and depressed about what we see on the news. All of which is stuff that usually doesn't have something to do with ourselves, and always is something that we can do very little about. So the first tip I have in dealing with these chaotic times that we live in is drastically reduce your news intake and don't get it from social media. For me, I do what Dad did. I read the news every morning. I think about the situations that concern me and that I can do something about, which are not many. And I try and get on with the challenges of everyday life, because that's what we all have to do. But in those challenges of everyday life, there's a lot that we can learn from experiences like this and our responses to them to try and improve things at the ground level. Not only did the Stoics say that we should only worry about what we can control in our lives, but Marcus himself says you will encounter people that are doing wrong, that are causing harm or causing grief. Marcus says, if you can, show them the error of their ways. But if you cannot, remember that kindness was granted to you for this purpose. The gods themselves, he says, are kind to such people and even help them to achieve external things, such as health and wealth and reputation. That's how kind the gods are. You are capable of the same kindness if you want, what's stopping you? So it might be a challenging thought for us to approach even the perpetrators of the carnage with that approach. But today I want to talk about being kind and being gentle and how that can transform your life and those around you, and perhaps lead to a kinder world where we witness less of what we've seen this week. It can be hard to understand why people can be so unkind or inconsiderate or even cruel to each other. And we witness it all the time. There are, of course, lots of different reasons why people can be unkind, but mostly those reasons come from inside them, not from what's happening outside around them. It might be a reaction to being treated badly. It might just be that they're having a bad day. Often, our outward behavior is a representation of our inward world. And frequently, when people are behaving in an unkind manner, they are experiencing a lot of anger inside themselves, and they're reacting to their anger. Now, mass riots, of course, are like a massive magnification of that. And none of this excuses their behavior. We're talking about using that to understand where are we all in how we react to things, and look how out of control anger can get. People often feel feelings of inadequacy and anger, and they lash out to other people. And often unkind behavior is an external manifestation of some kind of inner struggle to do with feeling inadequate and put upon, and for having to react. So when someone is being unkind, they have a struggle of their own. And our first step to kindness is understanding that. Of course, unkindness and anger tends to create more of the same, and very often leads to conflict. The easiest way to try and reduce the resistance and the anger and the reactions that we experience in the world around us is to approach everything with gentleness, to try and approach with softness and with kindness in our intentions. When there's struggle going on and strife going on, and when the people around you are behaving that way, if you respond with gentleness, it is very difficult for conflict to take hold. When strife is confronted by gentleness, it tends to disappear, because conflict can only exist when there are two opposing forces. If there's one force and one gentle, yielding, non-resistant force, the conflict has to evaporate. So it's partly out of compassion that we must do that. It's partly out of love. It requires patience. It requires understanding. And it requires a willingness to understand that this is another person who is dealing with their own struggles, of course, as I just said. And that an angry response to you or to the world around them is really related to that inner struggle that they have, very often with their feelings of inadequacy. Again, I'm not saying we have to excuse it. I'm not saying we have to do anything except defuse the situation, because progress won't happen, either interpersonally or for that individual, as long as there is anger and conflict. So remember, the most powerful way to diffuse interpersonal conflict like that at our personal level is to meet it with gentleness, not with an opposing force. It doesn't even mean that you have to yield in terms of the argument. It simply means that you will diffuse the power of the opposing force to do anything to you. And that will hopefully lead to negotiation or some other step. When we respond with gentleness, there is more of that love and compassion and understanding all around us. but it's got to start with ourselves. So if we try and do that as a response, we might eventually get to the conversation or the negotiation that can deal with the bigger situation. It's not a weakness or a meekness that we display when we respond like that. And of course, it's not just about being some noble person going out to diffuse everyone else's anger. In the end, of course, it is about our own struggle. And similar to the person who you're encountering who's dealing with feelings of inadequacy or anything like that, you have your own struggles of any kind that are also affecting your output and your reactions and the things that you say. And you also will say things that you shouldn't, that you'll regret, that get you into conflict as well. When we apply gentleness in situations where there is a challenge around us, or a conflict around us, or where someone is being aggressive towards us, it's almost like we create a vibration of gentleness in our own lives. We find a kind of a feeling of an inner power by choosing to move with the flow and not oppose the force. We feel more centered in ourselves and more powerful in ourselves. And by applying this kind of gentleness to the situations around us, it begins to pervade our lives around us. People perceive that in the same way we can perceive their anger and their aggression and all of that even before they've opened their mouths. People can, of course, do the same for your gentleness and for your inner sense of power, which is, of course, over your own life and your own responses. We're not talking about worldly power. Remember the Stoic injunction from the beginning. You only have control over you, yourself, your body, your life, not really beyond that. As we allow this gentleness to pervade our lives, we will find that people become more cooperative and themselves even become either a little more gentle or a little more cooperative or a little bit more confident that they're being heard. If you're responding with gentleness and kindness, then people do feel heard. And if they're feeling heard, they have less need to scream and shout or make any outward demonstration of their frustration and their anger. Anger and arguments are easily quelled when met with gentleness. Also because this whole idea of winning and losing, that also happens, that apart from the fact that whatever you might be arguing about is now an issue, we've got this underlying need that I've got to win. And it even can go beyond the specifics of what it is we're arguing about, and we just need to win an argument because we've got that competitive thing in us. When we approach things with gentleness, this dualistic idea of losing and winning becomes irrelevant. We are being patient and accepting those who are different, whose opinions differ. We don't have to win. And as soon as we diffuse the don't have to win, we diffuse it in the other person. As soon as we diffuse the reactiveness in ourselves by being gentle, it's pretty much like the other person has no option but to do that, quite naturally. A screaming person talking to a quiet person is going to stop screaming. And so gentleness and kindness, a listening approach, a consideration for the other person approach, all that allows that energy to diffuse. Kindness and gentleness spread easily, just like anger does. It's not really how we are encouraged to behave. We are taught to be assertive, to go for what we want, to be competitive. So gentleness needs practice. So we need to practice responding to things calmly in an even-handed manner. So try and soften your nature. Notice your responses and try and find a softer response to whatever it may be that's thrown at you, whether it's conflict from another person or anything like that. And gentleness is cultivated by taking a soft and open response to everything around you, especially nature. So learning to consider everything, to respond to everything in a gentle way is not so difficult with nature. Nature encourages us to do that, and that can be spread to the rest of our lives. Practices which also encourage gentleness: humility, quietening down our ego and not making it so much about us, encourages us to have a more gentle approach, as does forgiveness. If we take the approach of automatically forgiving, gentleness and forgiveness, these concepts are often found in theology, in religions, and so they're considered to be parts of belief systems. But in fact, they're everyday human things that all of us everyday humans can practice. Being supportive and having a soft and supportive demeanor, and of course being kind. All of these things help us cultivate the gentleness, and there's certain kind of characteristics that we can cultivate as well, that both will help us to be more gentle and which will also bring the gentleness out of us more. Obviously, empathy and compassion is the greatest one of those. Even if it just sets you thinking in a more gentle direction, is to try and ask yourself, why are they behaving that way? Even if you're looking at a massive rioting people, just as an exercise for yourself, you're not trying to pretend that nothing bad is going on, but just as an exercise for yourself to really try and get to the roots of empathy and compassion. Ask yourself, in such a challenging situation, where do I find the compassion and where do I find the empathy? This isn't a political discussion. I'm not suggesting we have to accept why people do these terrible things and be fine with that. None of the above. Remember, this is really about you trying to use that as a mirror to get down to the depths of your soul and say, where does empathy lie? And where does compassion lie? What are the limits of my compassion? If you find yourself unable to empathize or be compassionate, it's fine. But you use that as a way of understanding, where are the limits of that in me? What presses the button that makes me not do that? So I might not be sympathetic and empathetic about people writing, and I don't need to be. Because remember, my whole point at the beginning was, you don't need to watch the news because it doesn't affect you. But you can then take that into other areas of your own life and ask yourself, what triggers the resistance in me in ordinary situations? Ones that do affect me, ones that are directed at me. What is the trigger that switches off my empathy and compassion? And of course, what is the trigger that switches it on? But it's trying to find those limits. We're trying to develop greater social intelligence, awareness of other people. So trying to develop a sense of openness and curiosity about other people helps us do that. We're told by all our cultures and all our religions that we must respect and love other people. And that there are loads of other people who will give us enough practice to do that. So how do we cultivate the kindness and the gentleness, showing love, being empathetic, as I said, listening. Listening is such an important thing, because so much of anger and inadequacy and those things that I've said come out of not being heard or feeling that you're not being heard. Even riots and protests essentially come out of feeling that you're not being heard. So you don't necessarily have to take it that far, but it's that process of just being open, listening, and listening generously, being willing to understand them, being willing to accept their point of view, and be willing to respond in a generous way, something which encourages or which reinforces. And of course, good old generosity itself. also is a form of kindness. Being willing to give when it isn't called for or necessary or asked for. It even just gets down to the basics of being courteous. Being aware of other people is what makes us able to be empathetic, to show love, to do any of those things which cultivate these traits that I'm talking about. So, talking and listening, being socially aware and understanding that these other people are just the same as yourself. Kindness to others starts with kindness to yourself. It starts with creating and developing a better image of yourself and being positive about your self-image. It's one thing to say, go out and behave towards other people in this way. But getting back to what I said, if anger and all of those things come out of inner feelings of inadequacy or frustration or being hard done by, then the inner is the place that we will start. And if we work on those things in ourselves, then it's going to become easier and more natural to understand and accept other people. If we take the time to work on ourselves, we understand more than any other way that other people are the same, that they suffer from the same challenges that we all suffer from, and that they struggle with the inner feelings of inadequacy that our society easily brings out of us because it is competitive. And, part of our secret weapon here is to meet competitiveness with non-competitiveness. Undermine the system. Meet competitiveness by yielding. Certainly, all the great teachers have told us that. All the great teachers have told us to meet conflict by turning the other cheek, by meeting it with kindness and love. They are great masters which we can aspire to. But as I've said, just in the everyday situation, you can diffuse conflict by responding with gentleness, because conflict requires two opposing forces to meet. So, working on yourself, why do I get angry? What do I feel inadequate about? And working on your image of yourself, because when we don't like our image of ourselves, when we don't like ourselves or our version of ourselves, that's when we get angry and frustrated. So, learning about that in ourselves helps us recognize it in other people and helps us become more gentle towards them. So you can start off being kinder and more gentle by forgiving yourself. Start there. Then, of course, moving on to forgiving someone else no matter what. So there's an exercise that no matter what, I'm going to forgive them. We know we forgive because of our need, not just because of them. We can imagine ourselves in other people's shoes. Imagining ourselves in other people's shoes can quickly help you develop compassion. And also being kind to someone no matter what, especially someone you don't like. That's a great way to learn to be more kind. And of course, being especially kind to people close to you. The people close to us we tend to take for granted. We often end up neglecting them inadvertently for that. So deliberately being kind to the closest to you and the strangers. Then you have got the whole spectrum and you really are developing your kindness. Smiling at strangers, saying hello to strangers, hello, how are you? And being kind in the smallest ways, letting someone go ahead of you in the queue, not shooting forward in your car and holding back and allowing someone to get in, because what's it going to cost you except an extra few minutes to allow someone into the line and not just keep pushing through, someone's trying to turn in from a side road. It's those small things which are so trivial, but they are pro-social, pro-people, and evidence shows that pro-social behaviors increase happiness and they increase self-esteem and they affect the other person as well. Being kind improves how others see you, and it improves their acceptance of you and leads to less disease. less stress and greater reward in our life. Less disease, yes, because stress is also related to that. Research shows us that the more we do random acts of kindness, the more our stress level goes down, our immune system goes up, and our quality of life improves. Indeed, there's something every day that we can do to change our lives and of those of us around us. We can start right now. And I'll see you back here next week for a look at the month ahead.